The
Please
sound of a
don't take him
child
away from me.
screaming on the
He's all I
courthouse steps
have.
cut through the
I
cold October
understand,
air like a
but we're gonna
blade.
make sure he is
Richard's
safe
perfectly
now.
manicured hand clamped around his
Please
son's
don't take
small
him away
arm,
from me. He's
ripping the
all I
5-year-old
have.
from his mother while
I
she collapsed to
understand,
the
but
concrete,
we're gonna make sure he
begging.
is safe now.
What this politically connected lawyer in his $2,000 Navy suit didn't know was that the black woman crying at his feet had been living next door to Min Jung for the past year. And Min Jung, the man currently standing 3 feet behind her in a black trench coat, wasn't just the quiet neighbor who taught her son origami. He was the head of Shadow Soul, the most powerful Korean crime syndicate on the East Coast, and the phone in his pocket had already sent a signal to 30 armed men positioned in vehicles surrounding the courthouse. In the next 8 minutes, Min Jung would dismantle Richard's entire existence without throwing a single punch: his bank accounts, his law license, his reputation,
This
his
is
freedom.
unacceptable.
All because Richard
I need
made
that
one
information
catastrophic
now,
error
or the
in
deal is
judgment.
off.
He tried to hurt the woman and child that
Find
Min
him.
Jung had come to love as his
This is
own family.
unacceptable.
But the real twist
I need that
wasn't the
information
revenge.
now,
It was
or
the reason
deal
why
is
a man
off.
known as the Soul Shadow cared at all.
Find him.
Here's what nobody tells you about what happens when a desperate mother's protective instinct collides with underground power and a crime lord's buried grief. This is the true story of how one custody battle on courthouse steps triggered a reckoning that destroyed a corrupt lawyer in less than 10 minutes and revealed that family isn't always about blood. By the end of this, you'll understand why the man who thought money and connections made him untouchable is now serving 15 years in federal prison, and why the Mafia boss, who could have simply made him disappear, chose to do something far more permanent instead. Before we get into the destruction, and trust me, what Min Jung orchestrates is poetry, hit that subscribe button because we're dropping stories like this regularly, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get into this. Crystal's hands were shaking. Her son, Leo's terrified eyes locked on hers as Richard yanked him toward the black Mercedes waiting at the curb. The judge had been paid off. The lawyer had abandoned her case that morning with no explanation. She had nothing left. She thought she was fighting this battle completely alone. She was wrong. The hand that landed on her shoulder was gentle, but the voice that came with it made Richard freeze mid-step. "Let the child go." Min Jung's tone was quieter than a whisper, colder than winter in Seoul, and carried the weight of a man who had never had to repeat himself. Richard turned, his face still twisted in that ugly, victorious sneer, ready to tell this Asian man in black to mind his business. That's when he saw them. Black SUVs, dozens of them, materializing from side streets like sharks circling prey. That's when he noticed the courthouse security backing away. That's when Richard realized his money meant absolutely nothing. Before we dive into the destruction, and trust me, it's coming, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Crystal Oliver learned to measure peace in the smallest increments. A morning without jumping at sudden noises. A week without checking over her shoulder. 3 months without changing her phone number. By the time she and Leo had been living in the garden apartment on Ashford Street for a full year, she'd almost started to believe in the possibility of normal. Almost. The apartment complex was nothing fancy, just a converted brownstone in a neighborhood where people minded their business, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions if you paid in cash. But it had something Crystal hadn't experienced in the 5 years since Leo was born. Quiet. The kind of quiet where her son could laugh without her flinching. Where she could fall asleep without her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for the inevitable 2 a.m. text message telling her she was worthless, that she'd stolen his son, that he'd make sure she paid for ruining his life. Leo turned 6 that September. Crystal baked him a chocolate cake in their tiny kitchen while he sat at the breakfast bar, swinging his legs and chattering about his new teacher, Mrs. Ramirez, who let him be line leader twice in 1 week. She watched her son's face as he talked, animated and bright, unmarred by the tension that used to live in his small shoulders when he was 3 and could sense his parents' fights before they even started. This was what normal looked like. This was what she'd run for. "Mom, can I take a piece to Mr. Min?" Leo asked, eyeing the cake with strategic focus. He lets me help with his plants every Saturday. He said I have good hands for delicate work. Crystal smiled despite herself. Their neighbor in 2B had become something of a fixture in Leo's life over the past year, though Crystal still couldn't quite figure the man out. Min Jung was probably in his late 30s, always impeccably dressed even when he was supposedly just staying home, and possessed the kind of face that belonged in Korean dramas. Her coworker was always trying to get her to watch. Sharp jawline, intense eyes, movements that were economical and precise. He was polite to the point of formal, spoke English with barely a trace of accent, and seemed to be home at the oddest hours for someone who clearly had money. She'd assumed he worked from home doing something in tech or finance. He'd never corrected her assumption. He'd simply started acknowledging her in the hallway with small nods, then brief conversations about the weather. Then one day last spring, when Leo had been playing with a paper airplane in the courtyard, Mr. Min had caught it mid-flight and proceeded to show her son how to fold it properly. After that, Leo was hooked. Every Saturday morning, Leo would knock on 2B's door, and Mr. Min would answer in his expensive, casual-wear black designer jeans, fitted t-shirts that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget, and they'd spend 2 hours on his balcony. Leo would come back with some new paper creation, cranes, flowers, boxes with lids that actually closed. Once, he'd brought back a tiny origami dragon so detailed Crystal couldn't understand how human fingers had manipulated paper into those scales. "You can take him a piece after dinner," Crystal said, sliding the cake onto their mismatched plates. "But just one piece, Leo. We don't want to bother him." "He's not bothered," Leo said with the confidence of a 6-year-old who'd decided someone was his friend. "He told me I remind him of someone important." Something in Crystal's chest tightened at that, though she couldn't name why. Maybe it was just the reminder that this piece was fragile, that she'd built this small life on a foundation of restraining orders and changed addresses, and any moment it could all come crashing down. But that night, watching Leo carefully balance a slice of chocolate cake on a paper plate and walk it down the hallway, knocking on Mr. Min's door with the solemnity of a diplomat delivering important documents, Crystal let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe they'd really made it, that maybe Richard had finally moved on, that maybe this quiet life could last. She should have known better. The process server came on a Wednesday in October, right in the middle of Crystal's shift at Mercy General Hospital. She was a patient care technician, the kind of job where you did everything the nurses didn't have time for and got paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries. But it was honest work, and more importantly, it was flexible enough that she could drop everything when Leo's school called. She was restocking supplies in the ICU when Shanice from reception paged her. "Crystal, there's someone here to see you in the lobby. Says it's urgent." Her stomach dropped. Urgent meant Leo. Urgent meant something happened at school. She was already running before Shanice finished the sentence, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floors, mentally cataloging everything that could go wrong. Accident on the playground. Allergic reaction. Someone took him. The man waiting in the lobby wore khakis and a polo shirt, holding a manila envelope like it was a trophy. She knew what he was before he opened his mouth. She'd seen process servers before, back in the early days when Richard was testing how much he could torture her through the legal system before she'd just give up and come back. "Crystal Oliver?" His voice carried across the lobby, loud enough that visitors and staff turned to look, loud enough that she knew the volume was intentional, part of the humiliation. "Don't," she whispered, but he was already walking toward her, arm extended. "You've been served. Custody modification. Court date is November 3rd. He pressed the envelope into her hands while her co-workers watched, while patients' families stared, while the security guard by the door straightened up like maybe this was about to become his problem. Crystal stood there, frozen, the envelope in her hands feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Have a good day, ma'am," the process server said, and she could hear the smirk in his voice even as he walked away. She made it to the staff bathroom before the shaking started, locked herself in a stall and sat on the closed toilet lid, staring at the envelope she couldn't bring herself to open. Richard had found them. After a year of peace, After she'd finally let Leo settle into a school and make friends and stop sleeping with the light on, Richard had found them, and he was coming for custody. Not because he wanted to be a father. Richard had never wanted to be a father. He'd made that clear when she told him she was pregnant, when he'd tried to convince her to take care of it, when he'd disappeared for weeks at a time after Leo was born. No, Richard wanted custody for the same reason he'd married her in the first place, to own something beautiful and then destroy it slowly just to prove he could. The envelope stayed sealed in her purse for 3 hours. She finished her shift on autopilot, her hands doing the work while her mind spiraled through scenarios, each worse than the last. When she finally picked Leo up from after-school care, she held his hand too tight on the walk home. "Mom, you're squishing me," Leo complained, but he didn't pull away. He just adjusted his grip and started telling her about the frog dissection video they'd watched in science class. His voice bright with that particular 6-year-old enthusiasm for things that were simultaneously gross and fascinating. She didn't open the envelope until after Leo was asleep, after she'd read him 3 stories and scratched his back, and waited until his breathing went deep and even. Then she sat on her balcony in the October cold, no jacket, and finally tore it open. Emergency custody modification. Richard was claiming she was an unfit mother, that she'd kidnapped Leo, that she was mentally unstable, that she'd denied him access to his son. 23 pages of lies, typed in legal language that made her abandonment look like kidnapping and her survival look like instability. The court date was 3 weeks away. She called her lawyer at 8 the next morning. Janet Reeves, the legal aid attorney who'd helped her get the restraining order 3 years ago, answered on the 4th ring. Crystal could hear other phones ringing in the background, the chaos of an underfunded legal clinic trying to help too many desperate women with too few resources. "Crystal, slow down. What did the papers say exactly?" She read them over the phone, her voice cracking on words like unfit and alienation and immediate temporary custody pending full hearing. Janet was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Crystal, I need to be straight with you. Richard's hired Damon Foster." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Janet said it made her stomach clench. "He's one of the most expensive family law attorneys on the East Coast," Janet continued. "He's known for representing wealthy fathers in custody cases, and he's known for winning, even when he shouldn't. But I haven't done anything wrong." Crystal's voice came out small. "I have full legal custody. He signed away his rights to challenge custody in the divorce. Agreements can be challenged. And Crystal." Janet's hesitation lasted just a beat too long. "Richard's claiming you violated the custody agreement by moving without providing him your new address." "He was stalking me." The words came out too loud. She forced herself to lower her voice. "He showed up at my work. He followed us to Leo's daycare. That's why I got the restraining order. That's why the judge gave me permission to relocate without disclosure." "I know, but the restraining order expired 8 months ago, and you never renewed it. Technically, you were supposed to register your new address with the court within 30 days of moving. Did you do that?" The silence answered the question. "Okay." Janet's voice shifted into planning mode. "Okay, we can work with this. I'll file a response. We'll present evidence of his past behavior, the domestic violence reports, everything. But Crystal, I need you to understand something. Richard has resources. Damon Foster doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win. And I've heard rumors, nothing I can prove, but rumors that Foster has connections. Judges who owe him favors. Court clerks who lose paperwork at convenient times. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we're going to fight like hell. But you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we might lose." Crystal sat on her balcony that night, long after she'd hung up with Janet, wrapped in a blanket and watching her breath fog in the cold air. Somewhere in the building, someone was cooking, the smell of garlic and ginger wafting through the courtyard. A few apartments over, she could hear the muffled sound of a television, some game show where contestants cheered over prizes that probably wouldn't change their lives as much as they thought. She didn't hear Mr. Min step onto his balcony next door. She never heard him, actually. He moved like a ghost, silent and careful. But his voice, when it came, was gentle. "You are upset." It wasn't a question. Crystal wiped at her face, not wanting him to see the tears that had started falling without her permission. "I'm fine. Just a hard day." She could feel him looking at her through the decorative lattice that separated their balconies, could sense his stillness, the way he seemed to be listening not just to her words but to everything she wasn't saying. "Leo is precious to you," Minjung said quietly. "Anyone who threatens him threatens your world." Something about the way he said it made her look over. He was standing at his railing, dressed in black as always, holding what looked like a whiskey glass. His face was turned toward the courtyard, but she had the distinct impression he was seeing something else entirely. "Someone is trying to take him from me," she heard herself say. She hadn't planned to tell him, hadn't planned to tell anyone except Janet. But the words came out anyway, pulled by the strange safety of darkness and distance, and this man who'd spent a year teaching her son how to create beauty from paper. His father. "He doesn't want him. He just wants to hurt me." Min Jung was silent for so long she thought maybe he hadn't heard. Then, "There are men who mistake cruelty for power. They are weak men. Dangerous, but weak. The lawyers say he might win." Her voice cracked. "They say he has connections, money, and I have nothing." The sound of glass shattering made her jump. She looked over to see Min Jung standing perfectly still, his right hand closed in a fist, blood dripping from his palm where shards of his whiskey glass had embedded. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes were still fixed on some point in the darkness, his jaw tight. "Mr. Min, your hand." "It is nothing." He opened his fist, letting the glass fall to his balcony floor with a musical tinkle. "Please excuse me." He turned and walked back inside, moving with that same fluid grace despite the blood. His balcony door slid shut, and a moment later, his lights went off. Crystal sat in the darkness, staring at the space where he'd been, wondering what nerve she'd accidentally struck, wondering why a man who'd shown her nothing but distant kindness for a year suddenly looked like he wanted to kill someone. Inside, her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but she knew who it was before she even opened it. "See you in court, baby. Can't wait to watch you lose everything." She blocked the number. It wouldn't matter. Richard always found new ways to reach her. That night, she dreamed of Leo being torn from her arms while she screamed into a void that swallowed all sound. When she woke at 3 a.m., gasping, she got up and checked on her son, watching his chest rise and fall in the blue glow of his nightlight. He slept with his hand curled around a paper crane mister. Min had made him, the delicate bird somehow surviving weeks of a 6-year-old's affection. She didn't know that in the apartment next door, Min Jung was making phone calls. That his voice, usually so careful and controlled, was delivering orders in rapid Korean to people who moved in shadows and answered to no law but his. That by morning, Richard's life would start to unravel in ways small enough to seem like coincidence. Not yet. Richard Anderson prided himself on control. Control over his courtroom, where he practiced corporate law with the kind of aggressive confidence that made junior partners nervous and made clients pay premium rates. Control over his image, carefully curated through the right club memberships, the right cars, the right address in the right part of the city, and control, always, over the things he'd decided belonged to him. Crystal had belonged to him once. Beautiful, young, black, exotic in a way that made his colleagues envious and made him feel powerful when he walked into rooms with her on his arm. When she'd left, when she'd had the audacity to leave him, she'd taken that power with her. Worse, she'd taken his son, his heir, his bloodline. He didn't want the kid. Not really. Children were sticky and loud and needed things at inconvenient times. But the kid was his, and what was his didn't get to just walk away. So Richard had been patient. He'd waited for the restraining order to expire. He'd hired investigators to find her. And when they'd reported back that she was living in some working-class neighborhood, barely making ends meet, he'd smiled. Because that meant she was vulnerable. That meant she couldn't afford to fight him. The morning after he'd sent the process server to humiliate her at her pathetic hospital job, Richard left his downtown condo in high spirits. He had a breakfast meeting with a potential client, followed by a deposition, followed by drinks with Damon Foster to discuss their strategy for crushing Crystal in court. It was going to be a good day. His Tesla was parked in its reserved spot in the underground garage, gleaming and perfect. He clicked the key fob, and nothing happened. Frowned, tried again. The car's lights flickered once, then died. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, walking around to check the tires. All four were slashed, cut so cleanly it looked almost surgical. Not the messy work of kids with knives, but precise incisions that had let the air out in controlled hisses. He called the Tesla service center, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. They couldn't get someone out until the afternoon. He called his office, told his assistant to reschedule the breakfast meeting, and took a car service to work. At lunch, his credit card declined at his usual restaurant. He tried another card. Declined. A third card. Declined. The waiter looked uncomfortable while Richard stood at the register, his face reddening, aware of the other patrons watching. He finally called his bank, stepping outside while his colleagues waited at the table. "Mr. Anderson, I'm showing a security hold on all your accounts," the bank representative said. "Suspected fraudulent activity. We've been trying to reach you all morning. I haven't authorized any holds." "Sir, the algorithm detected unusual activity. Someone attempted to make several large purchases using your information. We've temporarily frozen your accounts, pending investigation." It took 4 hours and 3 supervisors before his accounts were unlocked. By then, he'd missed his deposition and had to endure Damon Foster's thinly veiled annoyance about wasted time. By the time Richard made it home that evening, he was seething. It got worse. His building's key fob stopped working, forcing him to wait in the lobby while security verified his identity. The dry cleaning he'd dropped off came back with bleach stains on his favorite suit. His gym membership was mysteriously canceled. His assistant reported that someone had hacked his work email and sent gibberish to half his client list. Each incident was small, explainable, the kind of annoying coincidence that happened sometimes. But they kept happening, one after another, a steady drip of inconvenience that felt like water torture. Richard was a lawyer. He didn't believe in coincidence. "Someone's fucking with me," he told Damon over drinks at his club the following week. Damon raised an eyebrow over his scotch. "Who would want to?" "I don't know. But right after I file custody papers against my ex, suddenly my life becomes a series of unfortunate events. That's not random. You think she's retaliating?" Richard laughed, sharp and mean. "Crystal? Please. She doesn't have the resources or the spine for something like this. She probably doesn't even have money for her lawyer." But the incidents continued. His car got towed from a legal parking spot. His condo association fined him for noise violations he hadn't committed. His favorite restaurant stopped taking his reservations. Small things. Maddening things. Across town, Crystal watched Richard's growing paranoia through the lens of his increasingly unhinged text messages and knew nothing about the invisible hand dismantling his peace of mind. She only knew that she was terrified, that the court date was approaching like an execution, and that Leo had started asking why Mommy cried at night. She didn't know that in the apartment next door, Min Jung was methodically working through a list, his voice calm as he gave orders in Korean to subordinates who understood that when the boss took a personal interest in someone's destruction, you delivered results. "Make him unstable," Min Jung had said. "Make him doubt everything. I want him off balance before he steps into that courtroom." His men delivered. Richard started drinking more, sleeping less, jumping at shadows. By the time he decided to escalate, to send a message that would put Crystal back in her place, he was already unraveling. The men arrived at Crystal's building on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks before the court date. 3 of them, dressed in dark clothes, sent by Richard with instructions to scare her a little, make her understand what she's up against. They didn't make it past the parking lot. Crystal was inside, putting Leo to bed, singing him the off-key lullaby she'd made up when he was a baby. She didn't hear the confrontation that happened in the shadows below, didn't know that Min Jung had intercepted them before they reached her door, didn't know that his men had been stationed around her building for the past 2 weeks, watching, waiting. By morning, she'd have no idea anything had happened at all. The night Richard's men came for her, Min Jung was standing on his balcony, smoking a cigarette he didn't want and waiting for the inevitability he'd been expecting. He'd lived long enough in the shadows to recognize desperation, and desperate men always escalated. They always chose violence when their control slipped away. He saw them enter the parking lot at 9:47 p.m. 3 men, moving with the false confidence of amateurs who'd been paid enough to feel brave. They wore dark hoodies and carried themselves like they'd watched too many movies about intimidation. Min Jung could see the bulge of a weapon, probably just a bat or pipe, under the tall one's jacket. He was down the stairs before they reached the building entrance. They never heard him coming. That was the thing about men like Min Jung, men who'd survived in a world where hesitation meant death. They moved like smoke when they needed to. He came up behind them in the shadows between streetlights, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "Gentlemen." He spoke in English, his accent barely noticeable, his tone almost conversational. "You've made a navigation error." The 3 men spun around. The tall one, clearly the leader, started to reach for whatever was under his jacket. He didn't make it. Min Jung moved with the kind of speed that came from decades of practice, closing the distance and breaking the man's reaching arm at the elbow with a single precise strike. The crack echoed off the brick walls. The man's scream followed. The other 2 backed up, suddenly realizing they'd brought amateur hour to a professional's game. Min Jung didn't pursue them. He simply stood there, one hand holding the tall man's shattered arm, the other casually adjusting his watch. "I'm going to tell you something once," Min Jung said, his voice never rising above that same conversational tone. "And you're going to remember every word, because your life depends on your memory being accurate when you deliver this message." The tall man whimpered, tears streaming down his face. His friends stood frozen, smart enough to know that running would just make this worse. "Tell your master he is knocking on the wrong door." Min Jung released the broken arm, letting the man collapse to his knees. "Tell him that the woman and child in apartment 2A are under protection. Tell him that if he sends anyone else, if he so much as drives past this building, I will interpret that as a declaration of war. Do you understand?" "We understand," one of the others gasped. "Jesus Christ, we understand." "Good." Min Jung pulled out his phone, tapped the screen once. 30 seconds later, 2 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot, silent as sharks. Men emerged, Min Jung's men, the ones who'd been watching Crystal's building in shifts for 2 weeks. "These gentlemen will ensure you receive medical attention. After that, you'll deliver my message. After that, you'll forget this address exists." One of his subordinates stepped forward, speaking in rapid Korean. Min Jung responded in the same language, his eyes never leaving Richard's 3 failed intimidators. Then he switched back to English. "One more thing. I want a photograph before they leave. Something memorable." 20 minutes later, Min Jung was back on his balcony, the cigarette burned down to nothing between his fingers. From inside Crystal's apartment, he could hear her singing to Leo, that off-key lullaby she probably didn't know carried through the walls. His chest tightened with something he'd thought died with his own son 7 years ago. He'd told himself for months that his interest in the woman and her child next door was purely observational, that teaching Leo origami was just a way to pass time, that the fury he felt when he'd overheard Crystal crying about the custody battle was simply a reasonable person's response to injustice. He'd been lying to himself. Leo reminded him of Ji-hoon, same age his son would have been, same quick smile and curious questions, same small hands folding paper with intense concentration. And Crystal. Crystal had the kind of fierce, protective love he'd seen in his late wife's eyes, the kind that would burn down the world for their child. Min Jung had built an empire on cold calculation and controlled violence. He'd ordered deaths and orchestrated downfalls, and never lost sleep over any of it, because everyone who fell had played the game willingly. But watching Crystal fight alone, watching Leo's small world threatened by a man who saw his own son as nothing more than a possession to reclaim, something in Min Jung's carefully constructed walls had cracked. He'd decided they were his now, his to protect. And Min Jung protected what was his with the same ruthless efficiency that had built Shadow Soul into the most feared syndicate on the eastern seaboard. Richard would learn that soon enough. The next morning, Richard received a message. A photo, delivered to his phone from an unknown number. It showed his 3 hired thugs, their faces bruised and terrified, holding signs that read, "We made a mistake." Below the photo, a text in English. "Tell your employer to stop knocking on doors he cannot afford to open." Richard stared at that message for hours, trying to understand how a woman working as a hospital tech could have that kind of muscle behind her. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. And that was exactly how Min Jung wanted him. Confused, paranoid, and walking into that courthouse without his usual arrogant confidence. The courtroom was smaller than Crystal had imagined, the kind of bureaucratic space designed to process human tragedies with maximum efficiency. Fluorescent lights, cheap wood paneling, uncomfortable benches for the audience. Judge Patricia Morrison presided from her elevated bench, her face set in the neutral expression of someone who'd heard 1,000 custody battles and stopped being moved by any of them, around case number 500. Crystal sat beside Janet Reeves, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Across the aisle, Richard lounged in his chair like he was attending a performance he'd already seen, knowing how it ended. Damon Foster sat beside him, a shark in a $3,000 suit, shuffling papers with practiced boredom. Leo was with Mrs. Chen from 3C, the grandmother who sometimes watched him when Crystal's shifts ran late. She'd wanted to spare him this. Wanted to shield him from watching his parents fight over him like he was a prize to be won. The hearing started badly and went downhill from there. Janet presented their evidence methodically. Police reports from Richard's stalking incidents, documentation of the domestic violence that had driven Crystal to leave, Leo's school records showing he was thriving, letters from teachers and neighbors attesting to Crystal's devoted parenting. She spoke passionately about stability and safety, and the bond between mother and child. Judge Morrison listened with the expression of someone mentally composing her grocery list. When Damon Foster stood up, his smile was all teeth and no warmth. He didn't dispute the evidence. Instead, he reframed it. Richard's behavior was that of a desperate father denied access to his son. Crystal's relocation without providing her address was parental alienation. Her modest income and demanding work schedule meant inadequate supervision. Richard could provide private schools, nannies, opportunities that a hospital tech working double shifts simply couldn't match. "Your Honor," Foster said, his voice carrying the weight of expensive law degrees and wins he'd bought with money and connections, "my client simply wants to be a father to his son. Miss Oliver has systematically prevented that relationship. We're asking the court to correct this injustice and grant Mr. Anderson the custody rights he's been unlawfully denied." It was beautiful fiction, delivered with the confidence of a man who knew the judge would buy it. Janet stood to object, to present their counter-argument, to explain that Richard had signed away his custody challenges in the divorce agreement. Judge Morrison held up her hand. "I've heard enough. Given Mr. Anderson's substantial resources and Miss Oliver's documented failure to comply with court orders regarding address disclosure, I'm granting emergency temporary custody to Mr. Anderson, pending a full evidentiary hearing in 60 days. The words hit Crystal like a physical blow. She heard Janet objecting, citing precedent, arguing that this violated procedure, but it all sounded like it was coming from underwater. Richard was being granted immediate custody. Right now. Today. She was supposed to hand over her son to a man who'd spent 5 years terrorizing her, and the system was calling it justice. "Your Honor, please," Crystal heard herself saying, her voice breaking. "Please. He'll hurt him. Not physically, but he'll use him to hurt me. He doesn't want to be a father. He just wants to." "Miss Oliver, I've made my ruling. Mr. Anderson's attorney will coordinate the transfer of custody. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with the finality of a door slamming shut. Janet was talking urgently about appeals and emergency motions, but Crystal couldn't hear her over the roaring in her ears. Richard stood up, straightening his suit jacket, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd won. He always won. Because men like Richard always won against women like her. They walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon, the sky gray and threatening rain. Crystal moved like a puppet with cut strings, Janet's hand on her elbow keeping her upright. She needed to get to Leo. Needed to hold him one more time before Richard took him away for 60 days that would feel like 60 years. But Richard had other plans. "I want him now," Richard said, his voice loud enough to carry across the courthouse steps. "I've waited long enough." Crystal turned, confused. "Now? I need to explain to him, to pack his things." "You've had 5 years to explain things." Richard pulled out his phone, making a call. "I'm sending a car to pick up my son. Give me the address where he is." "No." The word came out strangled. "Richard, please, not like this. Let me talk to him first. Give me the address, Crystal, or I'll have the police escort you." That's when Mrs. Chen called. Crystal's phone rang, and she answered with shaking hands. "Crystal? I'm so sorry, sweetie. I called you 3 times, but it went to voicemail. The hearing must have run long. Leo got so worried when you didn't call back. He insisted we come check on you. We're here, at the courthouse. We're walking up the steps right now." No. No. Crystal spun around and saw them. Mrs. Chen holding Leo's hand, the little boy in his favorite blue jacket, looking small and confused in the shadow of the imposing courthouse. The moment Leo saw his mother, his face lit up, and he pulled free of Mrs. Chen's hand, running toward her. "Mom!" Everything happened in slow motion and too fast all at once. Leo ran into her arms, and Crystal caught him, holding him tight, breathing in the smell of his strawberry shampoo and the grape juice he'd probably had with lunch. She felt his small arms around her neck, heard his voice asking if everything was okay, if they could go home now. Then Richard's hand closed around Leo's arm. "Time to go, buddy. You're coming with Daddy now." Leo's confusion turned to fear in an instant. "Mom? What's happening?" "Richard, stop!" Crystal gasped, but he was already pulling, trying to wrench Leo from her arms. Leo started to cry, then to scream, his small body caught between them in a tug-of-war that would leave scars neither parent seemed to care about in that moment. "Let him go, Crystal. The court gave him to me." "Richard, please, you're scaring him!" But Richard was past reason, past pretense. His face twisted into that familiar expression of rage she remembered from their worst fights, and he yanked harder. Crystal felt her grip slipping. Leo was screaming now, terrified, and she was going to lose him right here on these steps while people watched and did nothing because the law said Richard had won. Richard raised his free hand, and Crystal saw it coming, saw him about to shove her away, maybe hit her. She didn't know and didn't care, because if he made her let go, he'd take Leo and she'd never get him back. His wrist stopped in midair. A hand, elegant and precise, had caught Richard's wrist like someone plucking a flower. Richard's momentum halted so completely it looked impossible, like physics had stopped working. He turned, his face still contorted in rage, and found himself staring at Min Jung. Their neighbor stood on the courthouse steps in his long black trench coat, his face perfectly calm, his hand wrapped around Richard's wrist with the casual strength of someone who could break bones and had done so many times before. Behind him, Crystal suddenly noticed what she should have seen immediately. Black SUVs, dozens of them, lining the street, blocking intersections, surrounding the courthouse with the precision of a military operation. Men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, not rushing, not threatening, just standing, silent, professional, deadly. "Let the child go," Min Jung said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried absolute authority. Richard tried to pull his wrist free. Couldn't. His face went from rage to confusion to the first flickers of fear. "Who the hell are you?" Min Jung didn't answer Richard. Instead, he looked down at Crystal, still crouched on the steps, clutching Leo, who'd finally stopped screaming and was staring at Mr. Min with wide, hopeful eyes. "It's okay," Min Jung said to her, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I have this now." Then he placed his other hand on Crystal's shoulder, the same gentle touch he'd used when he'd steadied Leo on his balcony, teaching him to fold the wings of a crane. The gesture was protective, possessive, and absolutely final. He turned back to Richard. "You were given multiple warnings," Min Jung said, still in that quiet voice. "The tires, the accounts, the men who came to her building. I gave you opportunities to walk away. You chose not to take them." Richard's face went white. "That was you?" "That was me." Min Jung released Richard's wrist but didn't step back. If anything, he stepped closer, and Richard stumbled backward, suddenly aware that he was outmatched in ways he didn't fully understand yet. "I am Min Jung, head of Shadow Soul. For the past year, I have been Crystal's neighbor. I have been Leo's origami teacher. And for the past month, I have been their protection against a man who mistakes cruelty for strength." Damon Foster, who'd been standing frozen on the courthouse steps, suddenly bolted. He sprinted to his car without a word to his client, his expensive Italian shoes slapping against the pavement as he fled the scene he'd orchestrated. He knew exactly who Min Jung was. And he knew he'd just made a career-ending mistake. The courthouse steps had gone silent. Onlookers stared. Janet stood frozen, her mouth open. Even Judge Morrison, who'd been halfway back to her chambers, had returned to the courthouse entrance to watch. Richard looked around wildly, finally seeing what Crystal was seeing: the small army of men in black, positioned with military precision. The police who'd been standing near the courthouse entrance backing away slowly, hands away from their weapons, smart enough to recognize power when it stood in front of them. The black cars that had appeared from nowhere and everywhere at once. "This is insane," Richard stammered. "I have a court order." The judge, Min Jung interrupted, pulling a manila envelope from inside his coat, was bribed. $200,000 deposited into an offshore account 3 days before this hearing. The money came from your attorney, Mr. Foster, who has been very sloppy in his corruption. He turned and walked up the courthouse steps, past Richard, who stood paralyzed, past Janet, who'd recovered enough to look intrigued, straight to Judge Morrison. He handed her the envelope. "Your Honor, I believe you'll want to review this new evidence before that custody order is executed, unless you'd prefer that my lawyers deliver it to the Judicial Review Board instead." Judge Morrison opened the envelope with shaking hands. Her face went from pale to gray as she flipped through bank statements, photographs of Foster meeting with her in restaurants, photocopies of the offshore account transactions. Every piece of evidence meticulously documented, the kind of surveillance work that took resources and expertise most people didn't have access to, the kind of surveillance work that someone running a criminal empire conducted as a matter of routine. This isn't... She looked up at Min Jung, and whatever she saw on his face made her stop talking. "Your Honor," Janet said, recovering beautifully. "In light of this new evidence of corruption, I move to vacate the custody order immediately." Judge Morrison looked at the evidence, then at the small army surrounding her courthouse, then at Min Jung, who stood waiting with the patience of someone who'd already won and was just allowing the bureaucracy to catch up. "The emergency custody order is vacated," she said, her voice hollow. "Pending investigation of these allegations, the previous custody arrangement will remain in effect. Court will reschedule when this matter is resolved." She fled back into the courthouse like it was on fire. Richard stood on the steps, his expensive suit suddenly looking rumpled, his carefully maintained composure shattered. He looked at Crystal, then at Min Jung, then at the men in black surrounding them, and for the first time in the 5 years she'd known him, Crystal saw genuine fear in his eyes. "This isn't over," Richard said, but his voice shook. "Yes," Min Jung replied calmly. "It is." He gestured, and 2 of his men stepped forward. They didn't touch Richard, didn't threaten him, just stood on either side of him like an escort. "Mr. Anderson has an appointment with federal investigators," Min Jung said. And Crystal noticed he was speaking loud enough for everyone to hear now, playing to the crowd of onlookers that had gathered. It seems there are questions about certain embezzlement allegations, missing funds from his firm's client accounts. Very serious questions. You framed me, Richard gasped. I documented you, Min Jung corrected. The embezzlement is real. You've been stealing from your clients for 3 years. I simply made sure the evidence reached the right people. Richard looked like he might try to run, but where would he go? The men in black stood between him and every exit. The police watched but made no move to intervene. They recognized power when they saw it, and whatever jurisdiction they had here clearly didn't extend to what was happening on these steps. Take him, Min Jung said, and his men guided Richard toward one of the waiting SUVs. Not roughly, not violently, just inevitable. Richard went, his protests getting weaker as he was driven away to face consequences that Min Jung had spent 2 weeks arranging with the kind of detail that would ensure they stuck. Then the silence broke. People started moving again, talking in hushed whispers, pulling out phones to record what they'd just witnessed. Janet was already on her phone, probably calling her supervisor to explain that the case had taken an unprecedented turn, and Crystal sat on the courthouse steps, clutching Leo, staring at the man who'd been teaching her son origami for a year while apparently running a criminal empire. Min Jung walked back down the steps and crouched in front of them, his face level with hers. This close, she could see that his eyes weren't cold at all. They were sad, ancient and sad, like someone who'd lost everything and found something worth protecting again. Are you hurt? He asked. She shook her head, speechless. Leo? Min Jung looked at the boy, who'd stopped crying and was now staring at his origami teacher with awe. Mr. Min, Leo whispered. Did you just save us? Yes, Min Jung said simply. And I will continue to save you, for as long as you need saving. Who are you really? Crystal asked, finding her voice. I mean, I heard what you said, but... I am Min Jung, he repeated, with the ghost of a smile. I run an organization that operates in the shadows of legitimate society. I have done terrible things to terrible people. I have built an empire on fear and power. But I am also the man who lives in apartment 2B, who teaches your son how to fold paper cranes, who listens to you sing off-key lullabies through the walls and thinks it's the most beautiful sound in the world. Crystal felt tears streaming down her face, and she wasn't sure if they were from relief or shock or the surreal impossibility of this moment. Why? She asked. Why did you help us? Min Jung was quiet for a long moment. Then, 7 years ago, I had a son. His name was Ji-hoon. He was 6 years old when he died. Leukemia. I had all the money in the world, all the power, all the connections, and I couldn't save him. After that, I thought I was incapable of caring about anything except the empire I'd built. Then I met a little boy who reminded me that life still holds beauty even after loss, and I met a mother who fights for her child the way my wife fought for ours. He stood up, offered his hand to help Crystal to her feet. She took it, pulling Leo up with her. I am a criminal, Min Jung said. I won't pretend otherwise, but I am also someone who protects what matters to him. And you matter to me, both of you. What happens now? Crystal asked. Behind them, Min Jung's men were getting back into their vehicles, the small army dissolving as efficiently as it had appeared. Now, Richard goes to federal prison for a very long time. The embezzlement evidence is real, I just made sure it was found. The custody case disappears because he'll have no standing to bring it from a prison cell. And you and Leo go back to your lives, with the understanding that if anyone ever threatens that peace again, they'll answer to me. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Min Jung said. Just let Leo continue coming over on Saturday mornings. I've started teaching him how to make dragons with multiple folds. He's quite talented. Leo, who'd been silent through this entire surreal conversation, suddenly grinned. Really? Even after all this? Especially after all this? Min Jung looked at the boy with something like love in his ancient eyes. You are precious to me, Leo. You and your mother both. That doesn't change because I showed what I'm capable of when protecting what's precious. The three of them walked away from the courthouse together, leaving behind the onlookers and the whispers and the remains of Richard's dismantled life. One of Min Jung's SUVs pulled up, and he opened the door for them. "I'll take you home," he said. They drove through the city in silence, Leo sitting between them in the back seat, holding both their hands. Crystal watched the familiar streets pass by and tried to process what her life had just become. Her quiet neighbor was a crime lord. Her son's origami teacher commanded an army. The man who'd helped them fold paper cranes had just destroyed Richard's entire existence with casual efficiency. She should be terrified. Maybe she would be, later, when the shock wore off. But right now, all she felt was safe. For the first time in 5 years, she felt genuinely safe. When they pulled up to their building, Min Jung walked them to their door. Leo ran ahead to unlock it, disappearing inside with promises to feed his goldfish who probably missed him. That left Crystal standing in the hallway with a man who'd just revealed himself to be something out of a thriller novel. "I know you probably have questions," Min Jung said quietly. "About 1,000,000 of them." She paused. "But honestly, right now I'm just grateful. What you did today, I would do again. And worse, if necessary." He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or shame. Just truth. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. "To us, I mean." "No." The certainty in his voice was absolute. "Never to you. To people who threaten you? Yes, very much so. But you and Leo are under my protection now. That means you're the safest people in this entire city." "Who are you, really?" Crystal asked again, because the answer he'd given at the courthouse hadn't fully satisfied the question. Min Jung smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost boyish. "Just a neighbor, Crystal. One who teaches your son origami and thinks you deserve better than the hand life has dealt you. Everything else is just details." He started to turn away, to go back to apartment 2B and return to whatever his normal life looked like. But Crystal reached out, catching his hand. "Thank you," she said. "For being more than just a neighbor. For being what we needed when we needed it most." Min Jung looked at her hand on his, then up at her face, and something passed between them, understanding, maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. "You're welcome," he said finally. "Now go be with your son. I imagine he'll have nightmares tonight. When he does, tell him Mr. Min is right next door, and nothing bad will get past him. Will that be true? Will you always be right next door? For as long as you want me to be?" Crystal nodded, released his hand, and watched him walk the few feet to his own door. He unlocked it, paused, looked back. "Saturday morning," he said. 10 o'clock. Leo has dragons to learn. We'll be there." Inside her apartment, Leo was curled up on the couch, his eyes heavy with exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster of the day. Crystal sat beside him, pulled him into her lap even though he was getting too big for it, and held him while he finally processed what had happened. "Is Dad gone forever?" Leo asked. "For a very long time," Crystal said carefully. "He made bad choices, and now he has to face consequences for those choices. Mr. Min saved us." "Yes, he did." "Is he like a superhero?" Crystal thought about that. About the man next door with his sad eyes and dangerous power and gentle hands, teaching a 6-year-old to fold paper. Something like that. "I'm glad he's our neighbor," Leo murmured, his eyes closing. "I always felt safe when he was around, even before today. Me too, baby, me too." That night, after Leo was asleep, Crystal stood on her balcony and looked at the lattice separating her space from Min Jung's. She could see his silhouette through it, standing at his railing, smoking another cigarette he probably didn't want. "Thank you," she said again, into the darkness. "You already thanked me." His voice drifted through the lattice. "I know, but I'll probably keep thanking you for a while, until it feels real." "It's real, Crystal. Your son is safe. You're safe. Richard will never touch either of you again. That's as real as anything in this world." They stood in comfortable silence, two neighbors separated by decorative lattice, and connected by something neither of them fully understood yet. Tomorrow, Min Jung would go back to running his empire, and Crystal would go back to her shifts at the hospital, and Leo would go to school and tell everyone his neighbor was secretly awesome. But for tonight, they were just two people who'd found safety in proximity, who'd learned that family wasn't always about blood, and that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world were also the ones who made you feel most protected. On Saturday morning, Leo knocked on door 2B at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying the paper crane Min Jung had made him a year ago, the one that had survived months of a child's affection. Min Jung opened the door in his expensive casual wear, looking every inch the wealthy loner their neighbors thought he was, and smiled. "Ready to learn dragons?" "Ready," Leo said seriously. Crystal watched from her doorway as her son disappeared into the apartment next door, into the life of a man who commanded shadows but folded paper with the patience of a saint. She thought about Richard, probably sitting in a federal holding cell by now, learning that money and connections meant nothing when you declared war on the wrong family. And she thought about the future, uncertain and strange but no longer terrifying, because sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it came in the shape of a quiet neighbor who turned out to be a kingpin, who taught your son origami, and who decided you were worth protecting with every ounce of his considerable power. Crystal walked back into her apartment, poured herself coffee, and for the first time in 5 years, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. More than okay. They were going to be safe. Can Min Jung tell that the woman he's been protecting isn't the real Crystal? And what twisted game is Richard playing from his prison cell that connects these two women fighting for the same identity? Hit that subscribe button because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about this story. This is about to get darker than you can imagine. Drop a comment. Do you think Min Jung's protection can survive this ultimate betrayal? Like this video if you're hooked on this dangerous bond that keeps getting more complicated. The next chapter drops soon. And trust me, you are not ready for the truth about who's really living in apartment 2A. See you in the next one, if the real Crystal is still alive.